This video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kiev and Zelensky. During the previous 12 hours he made lots of very interesting statements and new large-scale strikes. Zelensky in evening address urged not to ignore air raid siren these days. Earlier, Reuters reported that Russia is preparing a second major strike on Ukraine after the SBU attack on air bases. Ukrainian military sources write that a cruise missile strike and more than 500 Shaheds are possible at night. So later, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, more precisely by the morning of the 9th of June of 2025, the Ukrainians provided us these numbers. And according to these numbers, during the night, 479 out of 499 targets were brought down by the Ukrainian air defense systems, including 460 drones, 4 out of 4 Kinjal hypersonic missiles, and 10 out of 10 Ha-101 cruise missiles. So obviously the Ukrainians, according to this article, shown us the significant result ever since the beginning of the special military operation, telling the truth. And telling the truth, it's very difficult to believe these numbers, because if you remember, on the 6th of June of 2025, so basically several days ago, the Russians carry out another massive missile strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine. And during the 6th of June, we got a lot of videos how the Russian missiles were flying above the sky of Ukraine. We got a lot of videos how the Russians were attacking positions of Ukrainian facilities, military facilities with different missiles. We got a lot of videos with air defense system work of the armored forces of Ukraine, and lots of videos with Ukrainian drones. And now we do, and all these events, all these things that we just discussed took place on the night between the 5th and the 6th of June. But when talking about the previous night between the 8th and the 9th of June, telling the truth, we didn't got anything from Ukrainian side, neither from Ukrainian nor from the Russian side. And telling the truth, I have a feeling that there were no attack during the previous night at all. So maybe the Russians attack Ukraine with missiles, with drones, but obviously the Russians didn't use 500 drones, or the Russians didn't use tens of missiles that were brought down by the Ukrainians. So something is wrong with these numbers, I think, but let's wait for the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. Obviously, they will give us additional details about this attack, if this attack ever happened. Anyway, today Zelensky made another important statement. We have come very close to the moment when we can force Russia to stop the war. We feel it. So this is the situation, and this is the reality Zelensky is living in. At the same time, the Russians are living in completely different reality, and the Russians, for example, during the previous 12 hours reported that we will simply cut off all the bridges across the Dnieper, a third of the country from the rest. So Russia has officially acknowledged for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation the possibility of attacking strategic bridges across the Dnieper. This was stated by Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom Andrei Kelin in an interview with the Sky News TV channel. According to him, Moscow is still conducting a limited military operation, not a large-scale war. So we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are living in completely different realities. Zelensky believes that he is about to stop the war and to stop the Russians. The Russians began considering attacks on Ukrainian bridges along Dnipro River, which will lead to complete collapse of the entire Ukraine. So this is the situation. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but now let's talk about the situation on the ground.
You still wearing cargo pants that feel like cardboard? That's why you need bearskin cargo pants.
And first, let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received any video that can confirm additional progress on the ground. Telling the truth, we haven't received even a single statement or post from any mapper that the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the settlement of Yunakivka or on the way towards the second layer, defense layer. We haven't received anything like this. But we got a very interesting article that was published by the Ukrainian Ukrainian sources. Ukrainian sources report massive Russian troop transfer to Sumy region. Over 10 self-propelled guns, air defense systems, and convoys of 40-plus trucks with ammo and personnel. We're observing the largest mass transfer of military equipment from Crimea Kherson region, Ukrainian source report. Ukrainian source also noted that the appearance of a new tactical marking on military equipment. We're talking about triangle within a triangle. So the Russians began redeployment of their forces in the direction of the city of Sumy, and most likely during the next several days the Russians will launch their second offensive, their second wave of offensive operation, with the purpose to establish complete control over the second defense layer. So something huge is brewing in this direction. Let's wait and see what is going to be next. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sivers direction and the Liman direction, because during the previous 24 hours we got lots of very interesting, weird and strange updates. First, let's take a look at map changes. According to information we have during the previous 12 hours, during the previous days, more precisely, the Ukrainians counter-attacked in the vicinity of the settlement of Tarskoye and in the side of the Kremenная forest. So after securing the northern part of Tarskoye during the last 5 days, Ukraine army recaptured new positions east and northeast of this locality. So several mappers reported that Ukrainians during the previous days managed to move further in the eastern direction and to force the Russians to fall back in the direction of the village of Dnipropetrovsk. Furthermore, neutral mappers reported that the Ukrainians counter-attacked inside of the Kremenная forest and managed to restore control over trenches and fortifications in the central part of the forest. So as you can see, based on these two arrows, we see that Ukrainians are trying to cut the Russians in pincers between the village of Tarskoye and Kremenная forest on the territory of Dnipropetrovsk and Kuzmina. Very interesting and weird offensive operation that was carried out by the Ukrainians, and currently it's very difficult to understand the goals of this offensive. Anyway, at the same time, according to the same reports, according to the same articles, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the Sivers direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians took under control several fields, tree lines and fortifications between the settlements of Grigorovka, Serebryanka, Siversk and Verkhnykamensk itself. So let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation on the map by the end of the 8th of June of 2025. The Russians control at least 50% of these strongholds in the Kremenная forest, and Ukrainians control fields between these settlements. And by the beginning of the 9th of June, we have adjusted the map both in Russian and Ukrainian favor. So this is the situation. We are waiting, of course, for additional updates and details. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. And when talking about this area, we start receiving lots of very interesting details and updates regarding the situation on the ground. If you remember, during the previous days, we've been talking a lot that the Russians somehow managed to break through Ukrainian defense and to answer the village of Alexandra Kalinova. We discussed the situation several times during the previous several videos, and we were waiting when the first geolocation appears, and today we got this geolocation that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in many places all over the entire line of combat contact, and there is one episode where we can see how Russians were answering the village of Alexandra Kalinova from the south. This is exactly the moment we were talking about during the previous days, and in this video we can see how Russian motorcycles answered the settlement of Alexandra Kalinova from the south. There are at least 2 motorcyclists in this area. So the Russians somehow managed to break through Ukrainian defense to answer this territory, but it's still unknown whether the Russians managed to dig in deeper and to establish complete control over the southern part. Furthermore, when talking about pro-Ukrainian sources, they reported that those bikers were attacked by the Ukrainians and they were forced to fall back. So this is the situation. Anyway, we have this video, and based on this video we have added additional enclave in this area of Russian forces. So we colored this territory as temporarily in Russian favor. Furthermore, we have adjusted the map to the south because we have additional reports from neutral mappers and from pro-Russian resources that these fields and these territories were taken by the Russians. So let's compare the map. So let's take a look at the situation by the end of the 8th of June. Just yesterday, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, if you remember, reported that the village of Zarya was taken by the Russians completely, and today we got additional changes on on the ground where we can see how Russians establish control over a significant number of territories in the direction of Alexandra Kalinova. So based on all these reports, we have adjusted the map, but as we can see, we have colored these territories as a contested area because we are waiting for additional proofs. Of course, we could color everything to the south of this enclave in Russian favor, but the situation that took place here is the same situation that several weeks ago took place in the vicinity of Dnipropetrovsk. If you remember, the Russians also attack as deep as possible in the direction of Ukraine positions with the purpose to cut the main supply lines, while another group of Russian forces was trying to attack this stronghold. If you remember, that battle ended probably with nothing because the Russians at the end were forced to fall back from the area of Dnipropetrovsk, and we still haven't received anything that can confirm Russian control over this territory. So here something similar happened. One Russian group entered the village of Krasna Kalinova from the south as a result of fast lightning offensive operation. At the same time and meantime, another group of Russian forces is moving through these fields, trying to force Ukrainians to fall back and to clear these territories. So something like this most likely is happening right now in this direction. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the western flank of the settlement of Yablunovka, and as we discussed in the previous video, according to information we have, the Russians managed to secure at least 33% of the settlement of Yablunovka from the west. When talking about different mappers, according to them, 40% of the village of Yablunovka was secured by the Russians. So anyway, despite some differences in numbers and probably understanding of how exactly the Russians managed to enter Alexandra Kalinova, we see that the turning point in the battle for this pocket the parties have crossed this turning point, and most likely during the next 1 to 3 weeks, the villages of Yablunovka, Alexandra Kalinova would fall in Russian hands, and the battle for the settlements of Kleban-Byk, Katerinovka, Sherebryanovka, and Novospaska would start.
My feet were swelling constantly, and nothing was helping. Then, I took a chance on these, so I almost made the...
Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction and in the Dnipro direction. During the previous 12 hours, Russian sources published this video, and in this video we can see how Russians and Ukrainians were fighting along the border between two regions, between the Dnipro region and the region of Donetsk. And in this video we can see how Russians were attacking positions of the armored force of Ukraine, how Russians destroyed several vehicles, how Russians destroyed several drones that Ukrainians were using to supply and support, and under the pressure of Russian units, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. And this is exactly the moment when 3 Russian soldiers crossed the border between Dnipro and Donetsk region, and how the Russians established complete control over this territory. This episode was geolocated exactly in this point. Yesterday, if you remember, we got another video to the west of the settlement of Goryokhova. Here we can see a few more Russian soldiers that crossed the border and another place, and based on these 2 videos that we got yesterday and today, we have adjusted the map, and now we see that the Russians have very strong positions along the border between Dnipro and Donetsk regions. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the previous 12 hours, the Russians managed to finish the battle for the settlement of Goryokhova, and the village was completely secured. So the Russians managed to get the border, and now there are no more barriers, no more settlements in front of them. The next step is the Dnipro region itself. When talking about the settlement of Komar, there are very heavy clashes for the village. The Russians continue their offensive operation, and today several sources reported that the Russians managed to outflank the settlement of Alexeyevka from the southwest and to enter the village of Zeleny Kut. So if this information is correct, then Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from Alexeyevka in the very near future, otherwise they would be caught in cauldron by the Russians. Very heavy clashes continue in the Gulay-Polye direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians were bombing and attacking the settlement of Poltavka by trying to reduce the village to ruins. So we are waiting for additional offensive operation in this area, and most likely the Russians will try to outflank the settlement of Gulay-Polye during the summer military campaign. And that's it for the short